What happens when you take the greatest thing ever made by an elf and combine it with the greatest work ever fashioned by dwarves? Surprisingly, perhaps, the answer is a catastrophe. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to the second episode in this series explaining and breaking down Tolkien's epic First Age tale of the Silmaril of Doriath. The main character of today's episode is going to be Thingol, High King of the Sindar, husband of a Maya, ruler of Doriath, tallest of all the children of the world, and owner of the only Silmaril in existence that isn't currently in the possession of the Dark Lord Morgoth. And as the name of this series suggests, that Silmaril, the one Beren and Luthien snuck into Angband to steal from Morgoth's crown, that got swallowed by the great werewolf Karkaroth before being presented by a dying Beren to Thingol, lies at the heart of everything this series is about. The Dark Lord still has two, but the third Silmaril has been taken from him. Now it is back in the hands of his enemies. Thingol's hands, to be specific. By the time this story begins, it's been 36 years since Beren and Luthien achieved their epic quest. 36 years of Thingol falling in love with the divine light of the uttermost west that's locked away within his great jewel. A jewel he has no inclination to share with anyone. As you'll hopefully remember, in the years after Beren and Luthien snuck into Angband, pinched a Silmaril and escaped with only one appendage amputated, the foes of Morgoth were inspired. They realized if one man and one elf can humiliate the Dark Lord that thoroughly, imagine what a union of all free people could achieve. That is the thought that motivated Mayathros, the eldest and greatest of all the Sons of Feanor, and arguably the elf who hates Morgoth more than any other. When Mayathros learned what Beren and Luthien had done, his heart was lifted, and he perceived Morgoth's weakness. He gathered an alliance, known as the Union of Mayathros, and he made plans for the ultimate battle to decide the fate of Beleriand. Now, as you surely already know, that battle ended up going horribly wrong. It's remembered as the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. But what's relevant to this video is that even before that battle commenced, the Union of Mayathros was compromised by a hateful conflict between two of his younger brothers, the worst two, and the High King of the Sindar, Thingol. Don't forget, the Silmarils themselves were originally crafted by the father of these sons. It was Feanor who gave his heart to their making. He declared them heirlooms of his house, and after Morgoth stole them from him, he and his sons swore a binding oath, evoking the name of Ilúvatar to stop at nothing in getting them back. They all swore, be he foe or friend, be he foul or clean, brood of Morgoth or bright Valar, Eldar or Maya or aftercomer, man yet unborn upon Middle-earth, neither law nor love nor league of swords, dread nor danger, not doom itself shall defend him from Feanor and Feanor's kin. Whoso hideth, or hoardeth, or in hand taketh, finding keepeth, or afar casteth, a Silmaril. In other words, no matter who you are, or which side you're on, if you ever cross paths with a Silmaril, the Sons of Feanor will be ready to take it back. So, as soon as it becomes known that Thingol now possesses the jewel taken by Beren and Luthien, Maedhros and his brothers, being constrained by their oath, send haughty messages to the King of Doriath, reminding him of their claim and summoning him to surrender his Silmaril to them. Very interestingly, I think, Thingol's wife, Doriath's divine queen, Melian the Maya, urges her husband to just yield the Silmaril to these bothersome brothers and be done with them. But, shockingly, proud Thingol refuses. On multiple occasions in the past, I have questioned Thingol's decision-making process and perhaps once or twice called him out for being needlessly difficult. Also, if your wife is a Maya, listen to her! Anyway, in this instance, actually, I do want to try and justify Thingol's decision to not surrender his Silmaril to the Sons of Feanor. Because, firstly, right, back in Valinor, Feanor and his sons committed the first ever elf-on-elf kinslaying. They murdered innocent elves at Alqualonde, who just so happened to be Thingol's former followers, his people. Then they had the audacity to set up shop in his realm of Beleriand, while simultaneously threatening him with violence. I think I'd probably be quite pissed off too. Secondly, I will remind everyone, during the events of the Beren and Luthien story, while those two heroes were moving mountains to shape the future of the First Age in a positive way, the two worst Sons of Feanor, Celegorm the Fair and Curufin the Crafty, two of the most despicable elves ever to exist, were actively working against them. They were villains in that story. Celegorm captured Luthien. He tried to force her to marry him. And then later, Curufin tried to kidnap her again, from horseback. Celegorm tried to murder Beren in cold blood, and after they both failed at both of those things, Curufin then tried to murder Luthien for no reason beyond malice and shame. These two brothers absolutely sucked long before Thingol ever acquired a Silmaril. And after he did acquire one, we are told Celegorm and Curufin vowed openly to slay Thingol and destroy his people if the jewel were not surrendered. Melian was right when she suggested Thingol should simply yield the Silmaril. Not giving Celegorm and Curufin what they want is generally a bad idea. But nevertheless, I get where Thingol is coming from. If the people you're dealing with are as murderously horrendous as those two, one might argue giving them what they want is even worse. Apparently, Thingol does not negotiate with terrorists. Celegorm and Curufin are the engine of so much misery and suffering in Beleriand. I really cannot blame the High King for refusing to appease them. However, there is another factor at work here. Thingol's decision to hold onto the Silmaril isn't entirely inspired by contempt for two of the worst elves ever to live. He is also motivated by the Silmaril itself. Tolkien tells us, every day that he looked upon the Silmaril, the more he desired to keep it forever, for such was its power. He craves it, he loves it, he has become bound to it, and it has become precious to him. As the years pass, the Jewel of Feanor sits unceasingly in Thingol's thoughts, until, eventually, it gets to the point where he liked not to let it rest even behind the doors of his inmost treasury, and he was minded now to bear it with him always, waking and sleeping. Which brings us to the very end of our last First Age series on the doom of Hurin. Shortly before Hurin killed himself, he came to Doriath's capital, the subterranean city of 1,000 caves, Menegroth, and there he cast at Thingol's feet an extraordinary dwarvish necklace called the Nauglamir. As I've already explained, this necklace was crafted by great dwarven smiths from both great dwarvish kingdoms of Beleriand, Nogrod, and Belegost in the Blue Mountains. Technically, the Blue Mountains form the eastern border of Beleriand, so they're not really in Beleriand, but that's neither here nor there. What matters is the Nauglamir was crafted by dwarvish skill, but it contains countless elvish jewels, brought from Valinor by Galadriel's wonderful brother, Finrod Felagund. And once the Nauglamir was finished, it was gifted by the dwarves to Finrod, and it became not only Finrod's most prized treasure, it was also the most famous dwarvish work of the Elder Days. The necklace was made of gold and silver and inlaid with uncountable gemstones, yet when worn it weighed no more than linen, and by the power that lay within it, it sat always with grace and loveliness, around whosever neck it was clasped. When Finrod Felagund died at the claws and teeth of a werewolf, the Nauglamir was inherited, along with the entire kingdom of Nargothrond, by Finrod's younger brother, or in other versions his nephew, Orodreth. Later, Orodreth died in the Battle of Tumhalad, and the Nauglamir entered the possession of Glaurung the dragon. Then, Turin, son of Hurin, slew said dragon. The Nauglamir was claimed by Mime the Petty Dwarf, and a few years after that, Mime the Petty Dwarf was murdered by Hurin himself. And then Hurin brought the Nauglamir to Menegroth. As I mentioned in the last series, in real life, a few years ago, a lost manuscript of Tolkien's was rediscovered and made public, and in that manuscript, called Concerning the Horde, Tolkien gives us a few extra details on this story that can't be found anywhere else, and aren't even alluded to in the Silmarillion. And the most important of these details right now is that in that lost manuscript, Hurin brought a great many treasures from Nargothrond to Doriath, including the Nauglamir, but all of them were infected with the curse of Glaurung, a curse of greed, effectively a form of dragon sickness, which led to violence, bloodshed, and slaughter between Hurin's Manish outlaws and the Sindar elves of Menegroth. As I say, this dragon spell and the ensuing violence between elves and men isn't mentioned anywhere in the Silmarillion, and it's entirely up to you whether you choose to imagine it in this story or not. But I find the sinister detail a very interesting wrinkle in explaining what happens next. After Hurin scornfully cast the Nauglamir at Thingol's feet and insulted him, magnificent Melian the Maya magically cleansed his poisoned mind of Morgoth's shadow, and she released him from the malice that was consuming him inside. Hurin then recognized his misdeeds. He stooped down, lifted the Nauglamir, and gave it again to Thingol, this time not in scorn, but as a freely given gift, from one who has nothing else. Then he departed Doriath and cast himself into the ocean to end his life. But the Nauglamir remained in Menegroth. It remained with Thingol, and in Tolkien's lost manuscript we are told there it gnawed his mind. After Hurin left, Thingol sat long in silence gazing upon the treasure that lay upon his knees, and as he did so, an idea formed behind his eyes. He is now the owner of the world's most perfect necklace, and he is also the owner of the world's only Silmaril to have been set free of the Dark Lord. So, what if he combined them? What if the Nauglamir were remade so that his Silmaril were set in its center? It would become the most exquisite object ever to exist in Arda, and Thingol would be its sole possessor. However, for such a thing to be pulled off, the elves of Doriath required the knowledge and the skill and the expertise of the dwarves of either Nogrod or Belegost. And so Thingol sent word to their great mansions in the Blue Mountains, proposing an alliance. I know we often think of elves and dwarves in Middle-earth as being rivals, or in some cases, like straight-up foes, and in this series we will learn a bit of why that's the case, but at this moment in time, that animosity did not yet exist. Thingol had a great friendship with the Blue Mountain Dwarves, especially the Dwarves of Belagost, and at around the same time Melkor was being chained and carried off to Valinor, way back at the end of the War for the Sake of the Elves, the Dwarves of Belagost united with the Sindar of Doriath to delve the underground city of Menegroth. Elves and dwarves worked together under the guidance of Thingol and Melian to build what was at the time the most wonderful elvish settlement anywhere in Middle-earth. And although the construction of Menegroth was completed at least 2,000 years before the events of this story, even so, it was still common, even necessary, for dwarves of the Blue Mountains to journey to Thingol's 1,000 caves on a regular basis, for their skill in the working of metal and stone was very great, and there was much need of their craft in the halls of Menegroth. However, if we look at a map, you will surely notice the mountainous strongholds of Nogrod and Belagost lie a very long way away from the woodland kingdom of Doriath, and so these dwarven craftsmen have to make quite an arduous journey to get there. They take the Great Dwarf Road from Nogrod to the River Gelion, then they cross at a place called Sarn Athrad, the Ford of Stones, before following another ancient road over a vast stretch of eastern Beleriand until they finally arrive at the Forest of Region. This is a journey their ancestors have been making for thousands of years now, but by this late stage in the First Age, Beleriand is no longer the place it was when Menegroth was first built. The wild country these dwarfs must pass through has now fallen to the forces of Morgoth, and so their trek is considerably more perilous than ever before. For this reason, the dwarves of Nogrod no longer travel as small parties of artisans, instead they journey in great companies armed for war. And so, shortly after Thingol's decision to combine his Silmaril with his Nauglamir, a great company from Nogrod pass through the Girdle of Melian and are brought to dwell within Menegroth. We are explicitly told, within Menegroth, the dwarves of Nogrod dwelt in chambers and smithies set apart for them. Which I find an interesting detail. Isn't it cool to imagine somewhere within the 1,000 caves of the Sindar's capital city, there's also a little dwarvish district, a neighbourhood for the Nogrodrim. Anyway, once these dwarves arrived, Thingol summoned them to his hall, and he declared his desire that they should remake for him the Nauglamir, while setting in its centre the Silmaril. When the dwarves beheld the great necklace, the work of their forefathers that was gifted to Finrod Felagund but was then stolen by Hurin Thalion following the murder of Mime the Petty Dwarf, something started festering in their collective minds. Something sinister. For these dwarves are the very first ever in history to look upon a Silmaril. And don't forget, from within the heart of a Silmaril shines the last of the divine light of the two trees of Valinor, the light of the Blessed Realm, something that no dwarf has ever really seen before. They beheld with wonder the shining jewel of Feanor, and they were filled with a great lust to possess it, and carry it off to their far homes in the mountains. But the dwarves of Nogrod resist this temptation. They squash it in their minds. When faced with both the Nauglamir of their ancestors and the Silmaril of Feanor, they conceal their true feelings and consent to the Elven King's task. In Tolkien's lost manuscript concerning the Horde, we get a couple of extra details here. It's explicitly stated in those writings, part of the sinister temptation that came over the dwarves was a direct consequence of them falling under the influence of Glaurung's dragon spell that infected the Nauglamir and all the rest of Nargothron's treasure. Which means, in later writings, both Thingol and the dwarves in Doriath were all being manipulated by the same dragon curse at the same time in the same place. They are all touched by the same supernatural greed. And we're also told in this manuscript, Thingol and the dwarves came to an agreement whereby the dwarves would be paid 1/10 of all the Nargothrond treasure for their work on the Nauglamir. But neither of these details are mentioned in the Silmarillion. Anyway, we're not told specifically how much time it took, but long was the labour of the dwarves in Menegroth, and they took both the Nauglamir and the Silmaril down to their deep smithies to get that work done. But throughout every second of their long labour, Thingol sat among them, a lone elf in a chamber full of dwarves, never taking his eyes off the Nauglamir, nor ever looking away from the divine light shining out of his Silmaril. I should point out, back in Valinor, all of the Silmarils were hallowed by Vada, the Queen of the Valar, so that no unclean hand nor mortal flesh could ever touch them without being withered and burned by their divine power. The only reason Beren was able to hold one is because he's got Iluvatar on his side, and Iluvatar supersedes everything else. I guess it's possible that the dwarves, despite being mortal, are somehow exempt from this hallowing. After all, they are sort of adopted children of Iluvatar. But we could also speculate that perhaps they were forced to wear really thick gloves whenever touching the Silmaril, and even then they would only be able to hold it for a matter of seconds at a time without enduring agony. It's interesting to think about, but we aren't actually ever told one way or the other. Anyway, eventually, Thingol's desire was achieved. The greatest thing ever made by a dwarf, and the greatest thing ever made by an elf, were brought together into one perfect object. The new Nauglamir, a Silmaril enhanced. When this necklace was held up, the light of its Silmaril refracted in the countless jewels, so that the Nauglamir did reflect and cast abroad in marvellous hues the light of the Blessed Realm. It's like the ultimate magical rainbow disco ball. And so, Thingol did what any High King would do when faced with the greatest treasure in the world. He made to take it up and clasp it around his own neck. But in that moment, the dwarves withheld it. They demanded that he yield it to them. For in their own words, "By what right does the Elven King lay claim to the Nauglamir that was made by our fathers for Finrod Felagund, who is dead? It has come to him but by the hand of Hurin, who took it as a thief out of the darkness of Nargothrond." Now, I imagine, upon hearing this, upon seeing his Silmaril and his Nauglamir right before his eyes, but being denied the treasure by dwarves, quite a few different thoughts went through Thingol's head. Chief among them, I am the High King of the Sindar. I am the highest authority in Beleriand. I am the tallest of all the children of the earth. I am older than the sun and the moon. I'm older than your entire race. Back when Durin the Deathless was still sleeping under a mountain, I was making a baby with a Maya. What it appears did not go through his head, however. I am alone in a room full of heavily armed dwarves. It seems in Thingol's pride and in his power and in his majesty, in his own home, he just could not see the danger. He said to the dwarves in a scornful tone, "How do you, of uncouth race, dare to demand aught of me, Thingol, Lord of Beleriand, whose life began by the waters of Cuivienen, years uncounted ere the fathers of the stunted people awoke. He stood tall, he stood proud, and he demanded the dwarves of Nogrod be gone from Doriath. Now, I will remind you, no one else was in this room when this happened. There was only Thingol and a company of Nogrod dwarves. So, from the perspective of everyone else in Beleriand, who knows what actually went down? Not a single witness to this event ever gets a chance to give an unbiased account. But Tolkien tells us, when Thingol ordered the dwarves to go forth from his kingdom without the payment they're demanding, their lust for treasure is kindled into rage. The dwarves rise up about the High King, they lay hands upon him, and in the deep places of Menegroth, they murder him. Thingol, once the only high elf in a land full of dark elves, dies alone, undefended and unnoticed, beneath the ground in his own capital city. And as his life leaves his body, as his Fëa departs his Hroa, the very last thing our Grey King ever sees, what he dies looking at, is the bright light of Valinor, shining out of the Silmaril that got him killed. The relationship between elves and dwarves will never be the same again. Doriath will never be the same. Beleriand won't ever be the same. The unwitnessed murder of High King Thingol is going to change everything. In over 6,500 years' time, the Elven King of Mirkwood, Thranduil, will bring up this ancient quarrel while dealing with Thorin Oakenshield during the events of The Hobbit. In the Second Age, while the elves of Eregion are fighting Sauron, Lord Celeborn will refuse to travel through Khazad-dûm because he remembers what the dwarves did in Doriath. And even in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli, the dwarf, will be treated completely differently from the rest of the Fellowship when entering the Sylvan Elvish realm of Lothlorien. Such is the long memory of the Undying Eldar. Both sides disagree on who was in the wrong, both sides disagree on what exactly happened. But in the near and long-term futures, both sides will realize the consequences of this murder turn out to be dire. And those consequences are what I'm going to explore and explain in episode 4 of this series. However, in the next episode, as I often do when a major character gets killed in the story, I want to make a dedicated character study on Thingol, to take a look at the entirety of his extraordinarily long life from a bird's eye view, share some thoughts on the inner workings of his character, and say farewell to the High King of the Sindar who, whether you love him or hate him, no one can deny has had an enormous impact on the stories of the Elder Days. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to click like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. You can now also support the channel on Patreon or Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you're at all interested. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Nevair Melanine.